I have strayed from Byron's PowerPoints and decided to introduce my own. Just be sure not to tell him. And it looks like I need to make the font a little bigger. So anyways, so the first thing, we're just going to go over things to remember. When we are going through Romans chapter 7, every time Paul mentions the words law, we are specifically talking about Mosaic law, the 613 commandments given by Moses, which is not to be confused with what many people call the moral law of the Bible, of the Old Testament, which is within the moral law is consistent of the Ten Commandments, which are still relevant to us as Christians. We are still bound by these laws. In fact, Jesus himself has mentioned 9 out of the 10 of them as in his new covenant. So they're still binding to us today. It's not like the whole law of it. It's not like we're a lawless people. There are still parts of the law that we are bound to. However, specifically, Paul is talking about the Mosaic law, the traditions, the eating kosher, no ham, which is really sad. He's talking about ceremonial laws, cleansings, before entering the temple, the Sabbath. All of these things is essentially what Moses is referring to. And the Sabbath is a complicated one to answer, but we won't get into that one tonight. That is a whole Bible class in itself. From chapter 6, there's a few things to remember coming into chapter 7, which we'll briefly go over. And that is these main points that Paul was just trying to drive home in this chapter. And that is the believer has died to sin. He has been freed from it, and that it no longer rules within us. And he really focuses in, he keeps just building on these points and using different words in a manner of speaking. Because he also mentions later on in chapter 6, freedom from sin also means serving righteousness or God, so that the fruit may be pleasing to God. That the fruit pleasing to God may be offered. So he's trying to get to a point here that it's almost essential that we need to die as Christians to this old law, to this Mosaic law, because it allows us to be fruitful. And we'll find out why tonight as we go through chapter 7, and why the old law was not in any way indicative of producing a fruitful spiritual relationship with God. And so going into that, if someone would like to read the first 6 verses of chapter 7, that would be great, and that way we can kind of read and see, what we're getting ready to talk about. I've broken it up into 2 sections tonight. We're going to do 1 through 6, which he introduces the big point, and then we'll kind of move into the remainder of the chapter, which he kind of talks about a whole nother point, a whole nother argument entirely. So if someone could read the first 6 verses.
I am speaking to those who understand law, brothers. Are you unaware that the law has authority over someone as long as you live? For example, a married woman is legally bound to her husband while he lives. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law regarding the husband. So then if she gives herself to another man while her husband is living, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law. Then if she gives herself to another man, she's not an adulteress. Therefore, my brothers, you also were put to death in relation to the law through the crucified body of the Messiah, so that you may belong to another, to him who is raised from the dead, that we may bear fruit for God. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions operated through the law in every part of us, and bore fruit to death. But now we have been released from the law, since we have died to what held, so that we may serve in a new way of the Spirit and not of the old way of the law.
Thank you. So Paul introduces a main point here, and then he kind of breaks that main point down into 4 more parts. It's a little easier to read now. So he breaks down the 4 main parts. So there's a general principle here that he's trying to put across in his illustration of marriage. The first one is that death covers one's bondage to law. Using this specific example of marriage, when someone dies, they're free from this law, specifically of marriage. Secondly, He's trying to prove that Christians who come through Christ, who put on through faith, put to death the old man, which is done through Jesus, by which we die with Christ, so that we are free from the old. So he's introducing the fact that when we die, we are severed from the bondage of the law, and as Christians, we have become so through the faith in Him, that we have been put to death with Jesus through Him, and we are therefore free from this law. And then another thing, kind of in line with chapter 6 that he's building on, if you remember that as Christians we put to death the old man. Here he said we're not only just free from sin, but we're also free from this Mosaic law through death, and not just sin alone, which has some, as we get into it, there's some parallels between the law and sin, and it kind of becomes a really convoluted, deep argument later on that we'll get into. But this death through the severing of this bondage to the law allows us to have a new relationship, and that relationship is with Jesus Christ. And that is what Paul is saying here. As Christians, we have this new relationship with Jesus, and we have put aside this old relationship with the law. And he's trying to get them to understand that in the most complicated way possible. So who is Paul speaking to? So there's essentially he starts off with a nice strong phrase, which is "Are you ignorant?" which is saying, "Are you stupid?" Which is not really what he means, but it kind of comes across that way. But what he's essentially saying is he's talking to a group of people who he's making this assumption that these readers already know this law, that these people he's speaking to, the Church of Romans, they know that, well, of course, if a wife, marries another man while she's already married to another, she's committing adultery, and that her husband or she has to die for that marriage to be annulled through the law. And he's basically just speaking. He's just saying, I'm getting ready to say something that's common sense to you. And then he goes and also calls them brothers and sisters and those who know the law. So you could automatically assume that you could kind of think that he might be just speaking specifically to Jewish Christians. But it is my opinion of the study of this is that that's not necessarily the case in this. Many of these Gentile Christians that are now converts have been around these Jewish Christians for a while. And if we actually think about it, a lot of these Christians who are not Jewish were likely converted where they would essentially needed a lot of Old Testament to kind of bring them up into this relationship with Christ. We sometimes kind of forget that the apostles, as they were preaching, were using the Old Testament. They weren't just going around just speaking their own word. They were basing their theology and their teachings off of the Old Testament. And many of these, probably these Gentile Christians, would have likely at least known a good chunk of it. So it's pretty safe to say he's probably speaking to the church as a whole when he kind of speaks about how this marriage and everything, this law of marriage and everything else works specifically. So it's not just specifically to Jewish Christians. But their argument could be made the other way, and I wouldn't 100% disagree with you. However, whoever it was spoken to specifically, it's a letter from Paul. So you never know. There's always some convolutedness to it since it is a letter. It's like reading someone else's mail, their own personal letters. Sometimes there are just things in there that are just insider information. But either way, the message doesn't change. But if I were to guess, it's likely that he was talking to everyone there at the church, Gentile or Jewish. I hope this looks good. So he essentially first gives this illustration of marriage. Oh, good, it looks nice. So he's giving this very basic marriage law, how it works. To us, it's a little more common because we grew up and we've all grown up in a Judeo-Christian culture where this is how things are done. We don't marry multiple women, or men don't marry multiple women. Some, unless you're Salt Lake City. But for the majority of people, this is the way we understand it to work. And he's giving this illustration. This illustration can be slightly dangerous for a couple of reasons for us as Christians studying it in our time. Is we can kind of get away from the point of it. Does that work? Oh, it's been a laser. We must be careful when we try to draw or relate this illustration in different ways, like trying to compare the first husband to the Mosaic law and the next husband to Jesus, because there's a lot of things that don't really necessarily make sense. The point is that Paul is giving this illustration because it's the perfect illustration for saying why someone is no longer bound to the law, and that is the point he is getting. He wants you to understand that he's not necessarily trying to explain comparing husbands to the old law and the new law. Instead, he's just trying to essentially break the point here that law severs one's bondage to the law. So the law. He kind of gets into the law there toward the end of the chapter, even kind of breaking into kind of going to meld here a little bit. The first half we just read into the second half we're going to read later, because it's kind of hard not to. But the context of being the law, we'll notice there in verses 5 and 6 of chapter 7, is that Paul kind of bounds being under the law as an existence in the flesh. And then later on in verses 7 through 12, he'll actually kind of talk about how being bounded to the law, living in the existence of flesh, is the power of sin to bring death. So therefore, when we die to the law, we are free from the condemnation of the old law, which is essentially the condemning nature of it, which of the law. If you've read if you're familiar with the Old Testament and the old Mosaic law, you know it can be very, very, very black and white on how things are. In fact, sin often led to your own personal stoning and death, which is something that once we are freed from this old law, kind of, if you're an Israelite and you're dead to this old law, then this is kind of a relieving thing to know. But it can also fail. The law also primarily just fails us. Paul's main point here is that not only does the law fail with dealing with sin in general, as we discussed earlier in Romans with Byron, but it's an instrument that stimulates the sin in a person, to the person it's bound to. As Christians, we're no longer bound to that sin. If we look back on the older chapters of Romans, we know that our death with Christ has freed us from sin. But to the man who is not free from sin in Christ, the law, if you're still under the law, then the law itself stimulates sin. And we'll kind of get a little more into that as well. But the law has made sin worse than what it was before the law. When we think about, I use this example on Sunday. When you think about telling a child not to go outside and jump in a puddle, what does that child want to do? He wants, yeah. Yeah, he wants to go jump in the puddle. He wants to go. His interest is stimulated into doing something that he's not wanting to do. And even though it's a child, there's a little bit of that in all of us. There's part of us that wants to go jump in that puddle. I don't like to. I like to be clean, but so when we're talking about law, this is a reminder that when we talk about the law, we're talking specifically about the Mosaic law, not the law as a whole. So the first thing we want to kind of think about here is we can't conclude that the law as a whole plays no role or doesn't have any meaning in our life as a Christian. The Old Testament just continues to teach us about the glory and holiness of God and His will. As forementioned, Jesus in the New Testament primarily teaches still about 9 out of the 10 commandments, and the missing one is keeping the Sabbath. And so it's not the entirety of the law that is unimportant to our lives. And now that we are dead to the law, it's not that we are without law. Instead, we are bound by a new and perfect law, a law that removes sins perfectly and does not stimulate or use provoke sin within us. And there's a couple verses I'd like to look at for that. The first one is in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2. Which just reads, "Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." And then in 1 Corinthians 9, 20 and through 22, it says, "To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, no, not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside of the law, not being outside of the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside of the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some." So, let me put that on there. That looks horrible. Anyways, so the point Paul here is trying to make is he's not trying to say the law is useless or meaningless, now that we are Christians. The purpose is that we are leaving this old law for a new one, a new and better one. And that is this point that Paul is trying to get to. Is not necessarily, right now he is primarily speaking to the fact of we're trying to get out of this we want to be out of this old law. We, as Christians, are now out of this old law, and we are bound to this new law. So why would you want the old law? Because the old law is insufficient for not only fixing our sins, but for the main point that Paul is trying to bring them to. The purpose of being free from the law is so that we may bear fruit for God. Not only are we just trying to not sin, but we're actually trying to produce something meaningful. Not only is it just fruit for God, but it's fruit for ourselves. And as you look at the fruits of the Spirit, those are particular character values that we want as Christians. And being bound to the law prevents such a thing from happening. So, if it's so we've mostly been talking about Jewish people under the law, and of course there's Gentiles, as aforementioned, who are likely know significant amounts of the Old Testament law, but they were not. If they were considered not under it, well, what about them? What about the Gentiles if they were never under the law in the first place? One time, I'll keep my finger on the right button. So did the Gentiles need to be under the law to die with Christ through faith? And the answer is quite simply no. This was the whole point of the first several chapters of Paul's letter. He's trying to get to prove this point, is that the Old Testament is no longer needed in general, or the old law is no longer needed in general for salvation through entering the kingdom of God. And because there is a lot of these Jewish Christians kind of bringing this theology, and not only in the book of Romans, but pretty much majority of the letters written, Paul is dealing with this issue constantly, and it seemed to be like his main fight throughout his life. And the answer is just simply no. You don't. The law has no effect on the Gentile. Even he does not have to come through the law to remove the law from him, so that he can be joined to this new law and this new covenant. In chapter 3, in verse 21 of Romans, it reads, "But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it." So his point is, the righteousness of God is now separate from this old law. It's not needed for righteousness, and its purpose now is just simply to bear witness to what has happened with Jesus Christ, his life that he lived, the laws that he did fulfill. Christ fulfilled all laws perfectly, as we learn about him through the gospel. And without those old laws, Jesus' sacrifices would have been meaningless. Without them, we would have no sacrifice for sins. We would not know the righteousness of God and His love if we did not have it. And so it still plays a significant part in it, but it's not required for a non-Jewish person to be joined with Jesus. So whether we're Jewish or not, the power of the Mosaic Law has no power over us, Jewish or Greek, Jewish or Gentile. So he's pointing this fact that Gentiles are not needed to go under the law. So then we kind of come to this concept of sin in the law. In verse 5 of chapter 7, Paul establishes that this unique concept here, talking about the domain of the flesh, when it says to be in the flesh. And he mentions three powers, specifically in verse 5, that kind of make up this place of the flesh, what it means to be in the flesh. And those things are the sin, the law, and death. And from now on, Paul is going to be very negative about the law. And then he'll redeem it a little bit at the end of chapter 7. But through these three things, we remain in the domain of flesh. And he brings these three things together, claiming that sinful passions work through the law to bring death, showing that sin works through the law, and they're very closely related. That sin and the law kind of have a unhealthy relationship, as we'll kind of understand. And then not only does the law reveal sin, not only does the law reveal sin, and not only does it turn sin into a transgression, which is breaking of the law, but it actually produces sin itself, which is a concept we'll kind of look here and see here at the last half of chapter 7, which brings us into the last section. He's going to kind of build on this, because what he's going to do is at the very beginning, sorry if I just shine the laser in someone's face, is he's going to bring up this, he's going to ask a really important question, which is, well, if sin and the law if the law brings sin, then is the law sinful? And he's going to answer that question here at the latter half, what I'm calling the latter half because I decided to split it up into halves. The latter half here of the book. If someone would be willing to read verses 7 through 25 for me.
What shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is death. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin became alive and I died. And this commandment, which was to result in life, proved to result in death for me. For sin, taking an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Therefore did that which is good become a cause of death for me. May it never be. Rather, it was sin, in order that it might be shown to be sin by effecting my death through that which is good, so that through the commandment sin would become utterly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into bondage to sin. For what I am doing I do not understand, for I am not practicing what I would like to do, but I am doing the very thing I hate. But if if I do the very thing I do not want to do, I agree with the law, confessing that the law is good. So now, no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For the willing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. For the good that I want to do, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. But if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man, but I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin, which is in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, on the one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other, with my flesh, the law of sin.
Thank you. So this brings up an important question. Well, first, Paul brings a pretty big question right off the bat. But before I get to his, I want to talk about mine. How does the law produce sin? Which is kind of a concept that kind of rolls over from the first 6 verses and then kind of continues a little bit into 7 through 25. So I do want to just kind of go over that question a little bit because then it's going to kind of bring in the idea, which is going to lead to the question, well, why does Paul bring in the question to defend himself? Is the law sin? So if the law produces sin, then it must be sin. But so does the law produce sin? Well, the answer is, in a manner of speaking, yes, it does produce sin. But to further explain, the answer is essentially sinful passions are those desires to disobey God and His law that, in a weird way, paradoxically, kind of makes sin worse by the law itself. So essentially, what Paul is kind of just trying to describe here is that the law is essentially a tool for sin. That sin itself is stimulating a rebellious human nature against God that produces more sin than what would typically be there. And the example of the child running and jumping in the puddle, that law, that statement of going and jump in the puddle produces desire within the child to go run outside immediately and jump in that puddle. And that is what he's essentially trying to explain here. That there is something essentially within us as humans that is essentially flawed, that makes us where we want to do something contrary to the law of God, and that is why the law produces sin. And in addition to it, the law not only just condemns sin and increases sin, but it increases the seriousness of sinning by branding sinful fare as a violation. So if you were to a child who may know that it's not okay to go jump out in that puddle because they know his mother would not like it, even though his mother has not explicitly said not to go jump in that puddle, if he goes and jumps in the puddle, there's some kind of leeway there. There's some less seriousness to it. If your child has ever done something that you did not want them to do, but you've never told them not to do, it's a lot less. There's a lot less seriousness to it than if you just told them to not go jump in that puddle. And that is the point that Paul is kind of just trying to explain here in some of these later verses in there. And so it brings up there's a specific example I'd actually like to look at, and that is actually the very first sin of Eve in the garden with the snake. In Genesis chapter 3, I'm just going to read verses 1 through 6, which is just Eve's encounter with the snake. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast in the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God actually say you shall not eat of the tree in the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave to her husband who was with her, and he ate. So, in this very specific first sin ever recorded, you can kind of see this moment happening here. The serpent comes to her, and Eve specifically says what she is not supposed to do as commanded by God as her law. And the snake just kind of tells her what she wants to hear. And within the woman, she immediately turns and thinks that this is desirable. Despite knowing, as she just mentioned, that she knows that it is wrong to eat of the tree, but does so anyway. And this is kind of the sinful nature within man that the law itself kind of produces and kind of shows, because if God did not command her to not eat of the tree of good and evil, well, would she have sinned? And the answer is simply no. But it wouldn't have been a real temptation unless she was supposed to, because it wouldn't have been a temptation at all to break the will of God, because there is a law there. And so we kind of see a little bit of how the law interacts with sin. And so Paul then, we'll then move on to Paul's question. Well, then is the law sin? How can God's law become such an opposing force to the history of salvation? How could God's law be an instrument of death and evil and sin? And so the answer, well, really, Paul has kind of been very pessimistic about the law, and he's about to redeem it here a little bit. He empathetically, immediately, right after asking this question, just says no, and he said, he said the law is not itself is not sin, as he will come to explain, but is instead is an instrument of sin. It is a tool in which sin uses to create more sin.
Sorry, friends again. I'm Florida College back now.
So Paul goes on to defend the law. First, he says he affirms that God's law in verse 22, the law is God's law. Sorry, in verse 22. And that is in good in verses 12 and also in verses 16. He calls it holy in verse 12, and just and spiritual, and that's in verse 14. So, and then he goes on. He explains the purpose of the law and why the purpose of it, because it is God's. He gave it to us as a spiritual gift, and essentially this is the purpose of the law that he kind of explains here. And this is one of the hardest, to me personally, it was one of the hardest things to figure out how to put in a PowerPoint slide, because it is such a deep concept. And that is, the law was used to define sin. Now, when we think about sin, we've kind of come to know sin in the church as simply as doing something wrong, and that's not entirely 100% wrong. However, in its original Greek and Hebrew meaning, it carries more of, you would say someone sinned if they lost their way, or they kind of missed the mark. And this is more of this is an important concept to know kind of going into this verse, is that when there's a difference between necessarily wrong and sin, though they are very correlated. In this specific explanation that Paul is giving, Paul is saying that that evil still existed. There was still wrong being doing, but by the coming of the law, we now know these wrongs to be sin as something that is straying us from God and His purpose, something that causes us to miss the mark with what God wants for us as His creation. And he also, as we've also kind of talked with Byron a little bit. He also implied that in chapter 1 and verse 32, and then again in chapter 2 and verses 14 through 16, that not only, but he implies that even those who are not under the law had some way of knowing, what was, even though they weren't under the law, that they have some kind of know of right and wrong. And we kind of attribute this to our conscience. But here comes the law, and the law comes in, and it essentially it basically shows which things are sin, which things get you away from where you're supposed to be going. And that's what the law did. And through that, it created some condemnation, because if you're under the law of Moses, then you know that coveting, as the example he uses, is wrong. And however, if you're not under this law, maybe you don't know specifically that coveting is something that causes sin with God. And so that was the purpose of the law. And that particular, it was supposed to essentially make man aware of sin. And by doing so, it actually just magnified sin further, which was kind of the earlier point there. And so and he kind of uses his example of coveting as he would not have known it as coveting unless the law said so. And that is the point of the law, is so it can define that, and that is the holiness and righteousness of God coming through. However, it has the reverse side here of condemning us more, because he specifically mentions in the book of Romans this phrase, the curse of the law. And that's a very unique phrase with a lot of deep meaning that is highly debated. But the general belief here is that the more we know, the more accountable we are, specifically. And but at the same time, we are not to remain ignorant in the Word of God. And this is kind of the curse of the law, if you will, to know what sin is, and and by knowing what is sin, you therefore kind of make yourself more aware of what you should be avoiding, and the more condemned you are if you willingly sin. And that's kind of essentially what he's saying the purpose of the law is. Now he gets a little more into it, and kind of defends the law here. In verses 7 through 25, he goes through part of that is he's giving an explanation that it's not the law's fault that sin has increased. Instead, it's that sin is a culprit that has used the law as a stepping stone to produce more sin and death. And then he also not only blames sin for producing more sin and death, but he also blames man. He also shows that through man's weakness and our internal strive to be rebellious, and we kind of go back to that theme there of slave and master, that we essentially allowed ourselves to become slaves of sin despite the goodness of the law. So sin works through us too, in producing more sin, is what he's getting at. And it's not the law itself. The law is just the means by which it tells us that we are sinning. And then he essentially kind of brings it to this pinnacle point here, where he says the law, God's good gift, has been turned into an instrument of sin because of the weakness and sinfulness of people, and therefore it's unable to deliver a person from the power of sin. And it really just shows us our need for this new law. Not that he's essentially saying, he's getting to the point here, he's trying to get us to move away from the old law. That is the whole point of the book of Romans. And so he's building to this point where he is stating that he is just showing more and more that this old law that we need to die to is insufficient for what we need it to be. Instead of removing sin and making us righteous, it is instead increasing the sin in our lives through knowing what is sin and our rebellious nature and deciding to further increase our sin. It brings us to the importance of being saved through the law of faith and that grace that is needed for that, and the covering and righteousness of sins that the old law itself could not provide. So he's building up to this point, and then he also mentioned earlier in this chapter the Holy Spirit, and that is essentially the premise. A lot of the premise of chapter 8 is, well, if we're no longer under the old law, and the old law is not sin, and we're under this new law, so what is the purpose of this new law? And he'll bring back, what Paul really likes to do is bring up a point, kind of bury it a little bit, and then just bring it up in full blast in a little bit. And that's what he's about to do here in chapter 8, which will start on Sunday. We have a few minutes left if anyone has any comments or questions. I was not expecting to get through all this. This is the whole chapter, and I was supposed to be broken up. But if anyone has any questions or comments before we're dismissed. No one?
Point out to me in this very last sentence, that
Yeah, I think it really just speaks to all of us. I honestly think this chapter is one of the most. We kind of read it and we don't always 100% understand it, but we definitely relate to it. Because if you've ever, we've all have sinned, and if you've ever been aware of it and look back on it, you kind of think back of what was in your heart when you made that decision to do that sin. And I think Paul really, really speaks to that here in chapter 7. And then I think moving on from that in chapter 8, it has this beautiful remedy for it that really kind of speaks to our lives as Christians in chapter 8. And also I think just what it's like being a Christian is just being freed from this kind of this feeling of just wanting to do evil because God said not to more of our decision today as Christians. We have willingly decided to live a new life that is pleasing, not just not sinning, but a life that is pleasing and fruitful for God. And God blesses those who are fruitful for Him. And he doesn't really get into that too much in chapter 7, but I think he gets into that a little more in chapter 8, and he'll further and further expound upon it. But it is true. I really do think chapter 7 really kind of speaks to our human condition. So, any other comments or questions? See the bells being rung. All right. Well, we'll be doing I don't remember the exact verses for chapter 8 off the top of my head, but we'll be starting chapter 8. So your homework, chapter 8.